Good day, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I am proud to welcome you to this edition of our 2021-2022 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series. This lecture series is supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA Brain Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Data Science, and through a grant from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. This year's theme is Ethical Challenges of Artificial Intelligence in Biomedicine, where we enjoy presentations on Fridays from leading thinkers about the promise, opportunities, and hurdles which are associated with AI applications in the biomedical sciences. Selected participants in our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program will leverage these presentations as vital material for our culminating in-person grant project development workshop to be held here in historic Charlottesville, Virginia, next June. Applications for the Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program are being accepted until January 31st, 2022. So please consider applying or encouraging your junior colleagues to do so. We will look forward to reviewing their materials. Today, it is my honor and my privilege to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jarrett Zigon from the University of Virginia. Dr. Zigon is the Porterfield Chair of Bioethics and Professor of Anthropology here at UVA. He is the former founding director of the Center for Data Ethics and Justice at UVA. He received his MA in Liberal Arts from St. John's College and a PhD in Anthropology from the City University of New York. He subsequently was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Excuse me. His lab has been funded through a Fulbright Hays Fellowship and Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research Award and the European Research Council, among many other sources. His interests include ethical theory, problematics of being human, the political ontological relationality, and thinking anthropologically about things in philosophy. These interests are explored in his most recent book, Disappointment Towards a Critical Hermeneutics of Worldbuilding and a War on People, Drug User Policy, and a New Ethics of Community. In continuing this year's theme on biomedical data science, Dr. Zigon's lecture today is entitled On the Necessity of Relational Ethics and Empathic Attunement for Data-Centric Technologies. In his talk, he will make a critical phenomenological response to the ethical demand that AI be sensitive to its varied sources of bias by arguing for what he terms as relational ethics. In contrast to the dominant data ethical arguments that call for the delineation of principles or rules, he will argue that only data-centric technologies are capable of empathic attunement, which can legitimately be called ethical machines. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us today. Also, our specially selected 2021-2022 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants are strongly encouraged to submit any questions for Jarrett via the chat feature in their Zoom sessions. I will synthesize these questions and ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of the lecture. And with that, welcome, Jarrett. We are super excited to hear from you today.
Thank you, Jack. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to talk today about ethics and data-centric technologies. But before I do, I just wanted to offer a bit of a warning. I'm not a data scientist nor an engineer. I don't code, and honestly, I more or less use my computer as little more than a very fancy typewriter. I am, to be frank, simply a theorist, who on occasion humbly attempts to think about our contemporary condition of existence and how we try to live within it. So my talk today will be a theoretical intervention in the emerging ethical concerns around data-centric technologies. Put simply, this is a theory paper. I will leave the practice to those who are able to do that and hope that they are inspired in their work in what I say here today. Most of my talk is extracted from an article called Can Machines Be Ethical? That I published about a year ago in the journal Social Research. So you're welcome to go to that journal and have a look. To begin today, though, I will briefly make some superficial distinctions of how ethics is generally talked about in relation to data-centric practices and technologies. Then I will continue by clarifying what I mean by ethics as relational ethics. And finally, I will provide an example that I hope illustrates that a relational ethics more appropriately responds to the ethical concerns many have today about data-centric technologies and my less than hopeful outlook on the possibility of its implementation. So let's get started. Ethics is a growing concern in the realm of data sciences, artificial intelligence, and data-centric technologies in general. There are good reasons for this. We are all familiar with concerns over such issues as data privacy or data-driven surveillance, or the increased intertwining of the data industry with the finance industry or the so-called defense industry. We are all familiar with the fact that data extracting and data-driven algorithms increasingly regulate the temporal, affective, and intersubjective modalities of everyday life. And we are all familiar with how this regulation, along with the sometimes over-the-top, but sometimes legitimate concerns of how AI may change the very definition of the human, as well as life itself, is increasingly not only of ethical, but existential concern. Indeed, there are good reasons why we are experiencing what I would call an ethical demand made by this data-centric situation we now find ourselves in. Unfortunately, at least in my view, the response to this ethical demand by most data-centric practitioners and ethicists is overwhelmingly framed in terms of principles, guidelines, rules, and ultimately law and policy. This response has taken various forms. Some, for example, have called for increased ethical policing of data science research, which might take the form of institutional review board oversight. Others consider it vital that data scientists themselves receive some form of ethical training to help combat, for example, blindness to both their own and structural biases that might inframe their work, or to help combat what is now seen as the widespread transgressions of data-centric industries. Finally, some have argued that data-centric technologies themselves, such as artificial intelligence, must be built with ethical capacities to help guide their inevitable shaping of human worlds. These are all reasonable and perhaps even necessary responses. Unfortunately, however, and true to the instrumentalist reasoning that guides so many data-centric practitioners, ethics in each of these various forms tends to be conceived in terms of what I call either the checklist or rulebook approach to ethics. What I call the checklist approach considers a practice ethical if and only if certain predefined principles can be checked off a pre-established list of such principles. Does a certain algorithmic practice respect the principle of privacy? Yes, good, check, ethical. That in essence is the principle-based or checklist approach to ethics in action. Similarly, the rulebook approach considers a practice ethical if and only if pre-articulated rules are followed. Have you guarded against the re-identification of your data? Yes, good, rule followed, ethical. That in essence is the rule-based or rulebook approach to ethics in action. While these two approaches may be useful in certain institutional or bureaucratic contexts for protection against litigation or ethical research compliance, for example, I argue they have nothing to do with ethics as a human practice and the cultivated sensibilities necessary to be and become an ethical person. Therefore, while the checklist and rulebook approaches may be useful, for example, in the very narrow concern of IRB research approval or the prevention of litigation, it is the wrong road to take if one were interested in, for example, developing ethical persons who are also data scientists. Or, as I will focus on in the rest of this talk, developing ethical data-centric technologies such as artificial intelligence. In order to clarify this, I will take a brief detour to consider an early and important critique of artificial intelligence. In 1965, the phenomenologist Hubert Dreyfus published a critical essay entitled Alchemy in Artificial Intelligence, which was later expanded into the book What Computers Can't Do. In short, Dreyfus was critical of the then dominant approach in artificial intelligence research that assumed that human intelligence is a matter of the mental representation of facts and the abstraction and interiorization of rules, and as such, researchers assumed that artificial intelligence could be achieved through programmed rules and the representation of facts. This is the symbolic information processing model of AI, or symbolic AI. Dreyfus predicted, rightly it now seems, that such an approach would fail as it began from the faulty Cartesian assumption of representationalism. In contrast to this Cartesian approach to intelligence, Dreyfus argued for an embodied and phenomenological approach to intelligence. Building on the work of both Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Dreyfus considered intelligence as primarily a consequence of our embodied and involved ongoing activity in situations in the world, through which, over time, we come to acquire not only background common sense understanding or intelligence, but also all the interests, feelings, motivations, and bodily capacities that go to make a human being. As such, intelligence is a matter of an acquired and skilled habit that is continuously maintained and developed by means of a kind of situationally sensitive feedback loop in response to ongoing and altering situations. Such embodied intelligence, Dreyfus argued, could never be represented by data structures made up of facts and rules. As he went on to put it, if the body turns out to be indispensable for intelligent behavior, then we shall have to ask whether the body can be simulated on a heuristically programmed digital computer. If not, then the project of artificial intelligence is doomed from the start. At the time, Dreyfus's intervention was contemptuously and publicly dismissed by most in the artificial intelligence community, but privately, many took it seriously and considered how to adopt his insights. Today, things have changed. It seems rather obvious that the contemporary successes of data-centric machine learning are at least in part a matter of these new technologies mimicking in some ways the phenomenological approach to intelligence that Dreyfus argued for. In his updated version of the book, What Computers Still Can't Do, Dreyfus acknowledges that data-centric AI, and he particularly focuses on neural networks, has made some progress in this direction. And more recently, he seems to have accepted that neural networks have to a great extent satisfied the requirements of this phenomenological approach to intelligence, founded on a kind of feedback adjustment between mind and world. Importantly, however, Dreyfus argues that the problem of generalization, a key element for intelligence, cannot be solved with a disembodied neural network, though he does indicate that a neural net robot with a body may be able to solve this problem. For now, however, I will set this aside, for the extent to which Dreyfus is correct in his analysis or prediction is beyond the scope of this talk. What, you may ask, does this have to do with ethics? In what follows, I would like to begin to convince you that contemporary concerns with developing ethical data-centric technology should make a similar shift in approach to a phenomenological and relational notion of ethics. The first point to make is this: the checklist and rulebook approaches to ethics, those approaches that speak in terms of principles, guidelines, and rules, are analogous to the symbolic AI approach to intelligence of programming rules and representing facts. Just as the AI community has learned, hopefully at least, that intelligence in practice is not a matter of symbolic representation, so too it must learn that ethics in practice is not a matter of following rules or adhering to principles. To put it bluntly, ethics cannot be pre-programmed as a set of rules or as a list of principles. This approach, outside of a few institutional and bureaucratic concerns, is a dead end. How then can we conceive of ethics in a phenomenological and relational manner? To begin to answer this, in the next section, I will articulate in broad strokes what I call relational ethics, before in the final section, turning to a specific example of the ethical failure of a data-centric technology to illustrate the importance of relational ethics, not only for the future of such technologies, but for social life as such. For the next several minutes, I will indulge in a bit of philosophizing, so I ask your patience. I hope, though, that it will prove helpful as we move forward. Perhaps the most fundamental of all ethical questions is to ask, how is it between us? Such a seemingly simple question is immediately differentiable from more commonly asked ethical questions, such as, what is the good? Or did she act rightly? And in this differentiation, its radicality is revealed. When we ask, what is the good? Or did she act rightly? There is an assumption built into these questions that there is the good, the whatness of which we can query, or an exact rightness that can come to modify precisely a particular act. When we ask these questions, we assume the prior existence of the good or the right already there as the object or the measure in reference to which the questions could be answered definitively. Oftentimes, the good or the right are articulated in terms of rules, principles, guidelines, and laws, the pre-establishment of which stand available as that against which we can measure our ethical adequacy. Is it possible to conceive of ethics without the good or the right always already there to measure up to, the standard by which any possible ethics is judged? In the rest of this section, I will respond to this question in the affirmative and begin to offer, in broad strokes, an outline for what I call relational ethics, as that which offers a response to the query of how it is between us. The work of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas is vital here. In contrast to all of those ethical theories that make the ontological assumption that human subjects exist as ethical subjects with some sort of a priori built-in capacity to act ethically, for example, to be rule followers, or moral calculators, or autonomous lawgivers and adherents, Levinas argues that the ethical subject is constituted through what he calls the other. What does this mean? Allow me to oversimplify. The other always exceeds any idea that I may have of that other. For example, in terms of what and who the other is, what the other desires, or even how I should act with and toward the other. And Levinas names this phenomenon of the excess of the other infinity. Because I and the other are always intertwined in this infinite relationality, as an ethical subject, I must give myself over or open myself to the unknowable and incomprehensible difference that is the other. Therefore, and in contrast to reducing the other to comprehensibility through a proceduralist act, I have what Levinas calls infinite responsibility to the other. Perhaps more appropriately rendered, I must respond to the call or demand of the other, or alternatively, I must attune to the other. Momentarily, I will return to this concept of responsivity and show how Levinas considers the form of conversation as the structure of this attuned response. For Levinas, not only the possibility of ethics, but the very possibility that I become an ethical subject begins with the other. This formal structure of the condition of possibility for ethics and the ethical subject is what Levinas calls transcendence. This notion of transcendence does not establish a radical dichotomy between ordinary everyday life and some realm beyond, and it does not necessitate religion or some other sphere of values. Neither, it should be noted, does Levinasian transcendence indicate an imminent urge to transcend any given option toward its presumably better state or alternative. Rather, it simply expresses the relational structure of ordinary everyday existence. Or as Levinas puts it, the ecstatic relationality of transcendence delineates the structure of exteriority, and thus makes possible the pluralism of society. Perhaps the ordinariness of this relationality is best revealed in Levinas's insistence that it begins in the bodily materiality of the face of the other. Confronted by the enigma of the face of the other, I must respond. I must attune. When this attunement does not occur in a smooth fashion, the enigma of the other makes an ethical demand on me, the experience of which is what I have called a moral breakdown. Far from the mischaracterization of the rupturing of the everyday made by those who have critiqued this concept of moral breakdown, the experience of a moral breakdown is, in fact, a more intensely felt and considered relational intertwining with others. And this relationality is more intensely felt and considered in the moment of breakdown precisely because the demand of the other has explicitly called me to ethically attune. In the next section, I will consider more closely how this attunement as empathic attunement is the very condition of possibility for ethics. Despite the significance of this relational structure for considering ethics, I have argued elsewhere that the asymmetry that Levinas posits falls short of the kind of mutuality of being some of us might prefer to consider. If for Levinas the other is separated from me by what he calls an infinite curvature of intersubjectivity, then my task is to conceive of this asymmetrical relation in more mutual terms without reducing this mutuality to a totalized co-relational pseudo-relation. That is, our question might be posed as this: how to maintain the enigma of the other and the asymmetrical relation this entails, while at the same time recognizing that the other must also relate to me as an enigmatic other. Put another way, how can we conceive mutuality without reducing this relation to a totality of the same? I will begin to address these questions by turning to what I call between. How is it between us? In contrast to asking the a priori question indicated by the what or did, a question that begins with the assumption that ethics is an accomplishment of a telos or acting according to a predefined measure. To ask how is to ask about an ongoing process imminent to situations within which we find ourselves. To ask how is to understand ethics as ongoing attunement. Who attunes? Us. In contrast to the individual who aims for the good or attempts to act rightly, and in contrast to a we that is a totalized or categorized plurality, the us that attunes is a non-categorizable plurality of singular beings that are neither individuals nor merely a part of a collective, but unique instances of being relational. Put in Levinasian terms, the non-categorizable us is indicative of a relational ontology that entails that the other is always infinitely other to me, as well as other possible others. How is it between us? This ongoing attunement immanent to worlds and situations is indicative of the ecstatic relationality that gives way to us. The place of this giving way I will name between, but do so with the caveat that this between that is relationality neither can be objectified, thing-like, nor spatialized through this nomination. And yet this between of relationality emerges. How? Phenomenological analysis would disclose multiple responses to this question. But given the limitations of this talk today, as well as its clear resonance with many ethical concerns raised by data-centric technologies, I will focus on one possible response, and that is language. The phenomenological hermeneutic conception of language is helpful here. A good starting point for understanding an important version of this is Martin Heidegger's claim that language is the house of being. What could such an enigmatic phrase mean? When he wrote this, he immediately followed it with this quote: "In it, in its home, man dwells." Humans dwell on language and do so as existing. For Heidegger, as it is for much of this tradition, to exist is to be ecstatic, always to be outside oneself, intertwined with other ecstatic beings, human and non-human alike. For humans, language is one of the primary entanglements of this relationality. Thus, it is to a great extent through language that humans are pulled beyond themselves to dwell in between with others. Notice, this phenomenon is a pulling and not a projecting. Unlike those conceptions of language that begin with a view of language grounded in a prior and already established set of criteria or grammar that is projected out from the individual speaker, a phenomenological view of language sees language as a primary affective force emanating from between us that pulls and places demands on us to respond. The manifold responses, which manifest more as listening than speaking, enliven the between by means of their distinction. Thus, in contrast to the projection of an assumed shared criteria or grammar, rejection that Levinas considered to be an act of violence, the distinctive and manifold responses to the call of language give way to a between characterized, above all, by difference. A difference, that is, to which attunement is ongoing. This is simply another way of describing ethics. Heidegger contrasted this view of language with more common conceptions of language, which, as he put it, is the notion that language is the expression produced by humans of their feelings and the worldview that guides them. As he went on to claim, this is a notion of language from which we must become liberated. This is the notion that assumes not only that language is structured by a set of shared criteria and grammar, but also can express a shared meaning. Elsewhere, I have argued against the anthropological focus on shared meaning and have tried to make the case that at least in ethical encounters, although I would presume this is indeed the case with most encounters, language does not express shared meaning, but rather acts as what I call a bridge of being. That is to say, ethics as ongoing attunement is not about adhering to a pre-established criteria or grammar, and neither is it about finding this thought of shared meaning. Rather, the extent that language is a modality of ethical attunement, it is that call, that demand, that pull, that allows the possibility to dwell once again with others in the world between us. Language as a modality of ethics then calls us, places a demand on us to be with others in the world in an attuned manner. Levinas wrote of this phenomenon as conversation. For Levinas, language is the relation between the same and the other, which is just a fancy philosophical way of saying me and you, whoever the me and the you might be. Ethically, this relation takes the form of conversation. Here it is important to emphasize that Levinas is not arguing that the actual act of conversation is ethics, though at times it may be, but rather that the form of conversation can be understood as the formal structure of ethics. What does this mean? In conversation, Levinas writes, we become astonished. Through conversation with the other, through conversation, the other is revealed in her strangeness to me. I can never know prior to the other speaking what she will say, and as such, I must listen and then respond. But I cannot respond with a projection. My response cannot be a claim of knowing the other, and neither can it be a taking over the conversational relation with the claim that, for example, yes, the same thing happened to me. Because the same thing never happens. Such a claim is not a continuance of open conversation, but rather shuts it down through the colonization of the other by me. In conversation, the other is revealed as not the same, which means that she cannot be thematized through a projection of an a priori criteria or grammar, or the claim of a shared experience, or the fitting into some preconceived principle or rule. Rather, to be in conversation is to let the other be and then attune. As such, relational ethics encounters the alterity of the other through attuned letting be that preserves the between of difference. If, as the anthropological linguist Eleanor Oakes has written, ordinary enactments of language are modes of experiencing the world, this can only be so because worlds and situations are already partly constituted through language. Constituted not, as I've been trying to argue, as worlds and situations of a projected shared meaning or a shared form of life, but rather as the between that pulls us together in our differences in the modalities of concern and care. How is it between us? This is perhaps the most fundamental of all ethical questions, because as humans, we can only live together in worlds and situations as intertwined in a between that is all we can ever share. It is for this reason that the philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that we are concerned and care for the between because we have an interest in its being, for the between is essential to the human condition. We are concerned and care in our interest, in our interest, that is, in our being between as being relational. If in 1958 Hannah Arendt could limit the between to the human condition, in the 21st century that is no longer possible. Today, such phenomena as climate change and the colonization of everyday life by data-centric technologies has made it abundantly clear that the between is essential to the existential condition. The between can no longer be limited to between you and me, but must be the between of existence. And yet, the manner in which the human responds to the call of this existential between will be decisive. Do we continue to project our already established rules and principles onto the between? Or do we let be and attune? If how is it between us is the most fundamental question, then how we respond to it must be the most fundamental of ethical as well as existential replies. I have just articulated in broad strokes a relational ethics that begins from the fact that humans are primarily beings who are relationally intertwined with others in specific situations, and that what counts as ethics in our everyday lives is not a matter of adhering to a checklist of principles or following a rule book, but rather responding and attuning to situationally unique demands placed upon us in the ongoing vicissitudes of life. In this sense, ethics is not a matter of deciding between a number of predetermined options, but rather in each instance entails a singular response to this situation now. Such a response takes the form of an attunement not only to the singularity of the situation, but to the singularity of the other or others there with you, and to do so in the modality of letting be and care. In the rest of my talk, I will illustrate the importance of this notion of relational ethics for considering the possibility of ethical data-centric technologies, and most importantly, their relational intertwining in our everyday lives. Consider the tragic case of Mark Hemmings, as recounted by John Cheney Lippold in his book, We Are Data. And this is a quote from the book. It's 2013, and Mark Hemmings, a 41-year-old British disabled man, dials the number for emergency services in the UK, 999. An operator answers, and Hemmings immediately makes his condition known. My stomach is in agony, Doc. I've got lumps in my stomach. The operator responds with the first of many inquiries. Have you got any other symptoms? Hemming replies, I'm in agony, sweating a lot, feeling weak, going on mostly all day. The operator asks more questions. Have you had any diarrhea or vomiting? Have you ever been diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm or Marfan syndrome? Have you got any crushing or aching pain in your upper abdomen? Through the agony, Hemmings diligently but excruciatingly answers them all. He requests an ambulance 3 separate times. He also explains his pain in description and accompanying tone as agonizing, a heartbreaking 7 times. At the end of the call, the operator concludes, from what you've told me, you don't require an emergency ambulance, but we will get somebody to call you back. 90 minutes later, a general practitioner did call Mr. Hemmings and recognized that he needed to be seen immediately. Still, he refused to make a house call and told Mr. Hemmings to take an ambulance instead. Mr. Hemmings told the GP that he had been refused an ambulance. Nevertheless, and not taking this important information into account, the GP still insisted that Mr. Hemmings come into the hospital and made an appointment for him. When Mr. Hemmings did not show for the appointment, his records were marked as did not attend. 2 days later, Mr. Hemmings was discovered by an in-house healthcare worker unconscious in his home and died minutes after having been rushed to the hospital. Mr. Hemmings died of a heart attack brought on by gallstones blocking his pancreatic duct. A routine operation would have saved his life if he had been correctly diagnosed and brought to the hospital. Although the official cause of death was heart attack, it is perhaps more accurate to say that the tragic case of Mr. Hemmings is one of death by algorithm. For the questions asked by the operator were not her own, nor were they read from some template, but rather came directly from an algorithmic triage system. The human operator simply acted as the mouthpiece, the voice of the algorithm. What can we learn from this tragic case? The most obvious takeaway is that an ethical relation is not simply a matter of input and output. Although relational ethics is, as I argued in the previous section, an ongoing process of responsivity or attunement, it is not simply a feedback mechanism. Mr. Hemmings provided all of the input he was asked to, but the output was not ethically adequate to his situation. Neither, obviously, was it medically adequate, but I will set aside that disturbing fact. I should note that almost certainly a linear algorithmic triage system was used in this case, which has as its essential task ensuring that certain rules are followed. Thus, it would be inappropriate to expect that it could attune to the singularity of Mr. Hemmings' ethical demand for care, as no delineated rules, ethical or otherwise, could allow for attunement. Input of this nature is simply illegible to such an algorithmic system. Some argue that a nonlinear triage system based on machine learning and other artificial intelligence elements would have the capacity to respond to the singularity of individual medical needs. This may be so, and yet this does not entail that such a system would be any better at responding to the singularity of ethical demands. For ethical demands are not a matter of providing more data, and ethical responses are not a matter of adjusting parameters to increase data. Let's be clear. The ethical demand made by Mr. Hemmings in his 999 call was not, for the most part, articulated through his factual description of his symptoms, but rather by means of his interjected affective utterances, sounds, and tone that infuse his answers to the algorithmic questions. Mr. Hemmings did not simply provide facts, but more importantly was making an ethical demand on another. Mr. Hemmings' ethical demand is not made in his description of his bowel movements, but rather when he several times says, "I'm in agony," or asks if he could have an ambulance, and speaks the entire time in an agonizing tone with interspersed sounds that indicate severe pain, suffering, and a vulnerable need for care. In other words, Mr. Hemmings' ethical demand is not made through the articulation of facts read as data that may or may not fit the measurable type of deserving emergency treatment. Rather, his ethical demand is made as an affective force, and as such, the other to whom this demand is made must be able to recognize it as such and respond as called. Such recognition and response are a matter of what the anthropologist Jason Troop calls empathic attunement, and not simply a matter of input-output adjustments. For Troop, empathic attunement is that human capacity that allows one to imagine what the experience of an other could be like. Importantly, such empathic attunement is a relational matter in that not only does the other participate in my empathic attunement with her, but she is simultaneously attuning with me, an attunement that I too participate in. We might describe this as reciprocal attunement. In this sense, empathic attunement and the imaginative process it entails allows for the essential intertwining of being human together. In other words, empathic attunement is essential not just to ethics, but to sociality as such. This is a key insight from the phenomenological tradition and the way in which empathy has been articulated within it. Thus, for example, the phenomenologist Dan Zahavi has written that empathy is the term of choice for phenomenologists for the experience of foreign consciousness. It is a distinctive form of other-directed intentionality, distinct from both self-awareness and ordinary object intentionality, which allows foreign experiences to disclose themselves as foreign rather than as own. It is important here to note that empathy is that which allows difference and alterity to emerge or become disclosed. It is that which allows for our recognition of the infinite singularity of all others, rather than collapsing the other into a projection of myself. Indeed, the philosopher Edith Stein was quite clear that empathy is a sui generis form of intentionality directed at the other as absolutely other. In this way, empathic attunement is that which allows for the asymmetrical and infinite relationality between oneself and another that I described in the last section, and as the essence of relational ethics. Thus, as a sui generis other-directed intentionality, empathy could be considered the very condition of possibility for ethics. Now, I'd like to take up this concept of empathic attunement in a radically relational manner. Thus, by empathic attunement, I do not intend the intersubjective coming to be connected of two self-same individualized subjects standing over and against one another, as this phenomenological articulation of empathy could be, but I think would be mistakenly read. Rather, by empathic attunement, I mean becoming attuned to always already having been intertwined with other beings through the ecstatic relationalities we essentially are. Thus, one does not have empathy for an other over against the self, but rather empathic attunement is the attuned relationality that constitutes what comes to be derivatively experienced as, for example, a you and an I. That is, and as I have already described, empathic attunement is that which allows for difference. Empathic attunement, then, is the coming into awareness of our essential relational being as differentiated, ecstatic relationality. Empathic imagination is the coming into awareness by means of this attunement of what it might be like as an other within this relationality of being. Empathic attunement and imagination conceived in this radically relational manner is essential to relational ethics, for it indicates that ethics is not simply a relational response of an input-output adjustment based on facts, but an attunement to the affective and differential relationality of intertwined existence. Similar to the way in which the philosopher Edmund Husserl argued that we always have a sense of the beingness of that which we perceive as a result of what he called a categorical intuition that is infused in our relational consciousness of any particular object. So too, I suggest, our attuned relational being is infused with an empathic intuition that provides the very possibility for ethics. To put it simply, without the capacity for empathic attunement, ethics is not possible. Mr. Hemings, in his own way, knew this well. He needed medical attention and sought it in the only way he could. Because this was likely not the first time he had dealt with the overly bureaucratic medical system of the UK, he seemed to understand that while he needed to meet the strict bureaucratic standards necessary to be offered care, he should also add an ethical appeal or demand to help persuade the operator to send an ambulance. If the bureaucracy fails to recognize him, perhaps the human would, he may have thought. Unfortunately for Mr. Hemings, he was not speaking with another human, but rather the human articulation of an algorithmic system. As such, an ethical demand could not be made by Mr. Hemings because empathic attunement was impossible. The much hyped human in the loop of normative data ethicists was rendered inhuman by being reduced to nothing more than the auditory supplement of the algorithmic system. Perhaps we could conceive of the operator as an anthropoborg, for as the human in the loop, she simply became part of an input-output factual feedback system, and not the guarantor of an ethical outcome as normative data ethicists would hope. With the human in the loop rendered inhuman, Mr. Hemings could not make an ethical demand because there is no other being with whom he could ethically and empathically attune, and who could attune with him in return. If, as Dan Sahabi has written, I am empathically attuned to the other as a center of orientation, as a perspective on the world, and as a result, my relation to the world will change, since the other will always be given to me in a situation or meaningful context which points back to the other as a new center of reference. The meaning of the world has for the other affects the meaning it has for me. Then this simply cannot happen with data-centric technologies. Current attempts to build what is called emotional AI, for example, will, I suspect, ultimately fail to live up to any expectation for empathic attunement. This is so because such attempts are founded on the assumption that data such as varying heart rate, the flutter of a microfacial expression, The sudden rise in skin conductance can serve as measurable and machine-readable signs of affect. As long as data-centric technologies can only recognize humans as just another object in the world that is a source of data extraction, then it will never be able to recognize a human as a perspective on the world that is above all else a dependently relational being. Without such recognition, a recognition that emerges in excess of any amount of available data, ethical attunement is impossible. Of course, data-centric technologies can't do this, one might proclaim in exasperation. But what of that operator? Doesn't she have a moral obligation to step in and override the system? Doesn't she have any principles? It would be too easy, and I believe naive, to level moral condemnation on the operator. For she, like Mr. Hemmings, was simply caught up in a larger neoliberal bureaucratic assemblage that values efficiency in the bottom line over care for others, be they human or otherwise. And data-centric technologies are just the latest tools for achieving these values. When efficiency and profit are the primary values, and instrumental reason is the primary means of achieving them, then all of those caught up within the various manifestations of this assemblage are too often rendered incapable of the most basic human capacities for ethically attuning with others. In this sense, algorithmic, artificial intelligence, and other data-centric technologies are the latest dream tool of neoliberal bureaucratic assemblages of control and order that render ethics nearly impossible. As a result, and not unlike the man standing before the law in Kafka's parable, Mr. Hemmings received no response, ethically or medically, as he pleaded for both before the cold logic of the algorithm, and then he died. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, antisocial personality disorder is characterized by, among other things, a lack of empathy for others, oftentimes exhibited in the process of accomplishing an aim or desired outcome by almost any means and without concern for how the outcome affects others. This disorder is more colloquially known as sociopathy or psychopathy. It may also be the best description of the algorithmic triage system described in the previous section, and perhaps all data-centric technologies in general. We should recall that the aim of two of the participants in Turing's famous imitation game, that is, the man and the machine, was to deceive the interrogator. The aim of the third participant, the woman, was to help the interrogator. Putting aside the revealing gender assumptions and dynamics that set the context of this game, we might like to note that thinking, and remember the question that guides the imitation game is, can machines think, is more or less equated with the ability to deceive another by means of strategic lying and deception, and without any concern for the other and how he or she may feel about this. What Turing identifies as thinking, psychology identifies as psychopathy. Today, the thinking machines that Turing envisioned exist and are increasingly folded into the texture of our everyday lives, such that when we ask, how is it between us, we oftentimes must count some form of data-centric technology as right there with us, if not disruptively between us. One response to this, of course, is to continue the head in the sand approach that has characterized much of the last decade or so, as these technologies have slowly and now rapidly become a part of our worlds. But in doing so, we must accept that we will surely see more and more tragic cases like that of Mr. Hemmings. Another response would be that of the normative ethicists and their principles and guidelines, who seem to think that ethics is little more than adhering to the checklist or the rule book, or perhaps even a calculation. This approach is appealing to data-centric practitioners because it matches well their instrumental view of the world. Ethics in this view is just another pre-programmable parameter to solve a predefined problem. Unfortunately, ethical demands and the responses they call for can never be pre-known or predetermined. For ethics to be ethics, there cannot be any predetermined mode of action and outcome. Ethics is not a program. It is a situationally attuned struggle to decide despite the undecidability of the moment. As such, ethical demands and responses can only be recognized as they emerge in situ and responded to in the best possible manner, which in many cases is simply a good enough manner, as the singular demand of this situation calls. I've been trying to show that because data-centric technologies are and will increasingly become a significant aspect of our worlds, we need to recognize that when we ask how it is between us, how we reply will be significantly determined by the way these technologies respond to us, there, in the between of our everyday worlds. This is what I urge data scientists and other so-called innovators and builders of data-centric technologies to realize. Just as artificial intelligence benefited greatly from the phenomenological critiques leveled against it by Hubert Dreyfus and others, so too only phenomenological and relational ethics can both adequately describe the responsivity of ethics, as well as offer a telos, as it were, for which that responsivity aims. We may one day discover that it is impossible to build data-centric technologies, such as artificial intelligence, that are capable of empathic and ethical attunement. But if we don't try, and try in ways that go beyond reading the human as a source of data extraction, then I'm afraid that our worlds will increasingly be populated by psychopathic machines. Thank you.
Jarrett, thank you. That was fantastic. I have several questions. As I was listening to you talk, and you made the comment of language is the house of being. And I thought a little bit about language and where language kind of fits into our biomedical research enterprise. And probably one of the most important places where it comes in the research enterprise is in the relational ethics, which involve informed consent between a researcher or an investigator and a research subject. And very often, researchers refer to themselves in the we are doing this research. We're very august, very highly accomplished people. We are our own unitary group, whereas them, the research subjects, are those people who are going to come in and do our experiments and basically be data providers for us. Flipping that around, the research subjects may have motivations for wanting to participate in that experiment. They may have expectations about what they're going to get out of it, if anything. Likewise for the investigators. And it's in that in-between that there is some degree of empathic attunement. And I was just kind of curious about how do we kind of overcome the tendency to view informed consent and the ethics involved with it as just kind of being pro forma checklisty kind of stuff? How can we actually take that more seriously and understand that there's an attunement that we need to achieve with our research subjects so that we can, one, make them full participants in our research and provide us with the kind of data we can, use effectively? Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Jack. So that question's a little bit different from what I was trying to argue in terms of kind of how we build ethics into machines, as it were.
But I'm going to get to that in a minute.
yeah. But what you ask is certainly important. And so on the one hand, I want to say that kind of the very model of informed consent and that often is part of, for example, IRB, Institutional Review Board, research, approved research, in a sense, is kind of goes against or is counter to or outside of what I've been trying to argue for, in the sense that it is, at least in my experience, and as an anthropologist who's done quite a bit of field research, I've always had to have that research pre-approved by IRB. But the IRB model is kind of this kind of, as I put it in the talk, this projection, this predetermined, preconceived projection of what the relationship already will be, and the consent may be informed in the sense that the research participant is now made aware of what how the research will unfold and they will be a part of it. But in most cases, they have very little say on how that research unfolds. They just kind of, as it were, consent to be folded into it.
Right.
To use the fancy language that I used a bit in the talk, it's a projection of the same onto the other. It's not a kind of listening and letting be to the other that I respond to as a researcher, and then kind of adjust along the way. Does that make any sense? So I think sorry, Jack, but I think the goal here would be changing the very idea of what an informed consent process would look like, such that it is a more mutual kind of, to use a kind of language that I would normally not use, a kind of negotiation. But that might be maybe the easiest, quickest way to put it.
That's interesting. You also brought up the experience of Mr. Hemmings, and you made the comments of death by algorithm. And any of us if you have lived long enough, you start to run into problems with relatives or loved ones who are admitted to hospital, and the nurse comes in and she, takes up blood pressure and asks, what's your pain level out of 10? And the person says, 8 or 9. And then the nurse walks out of the room and you're like, what was the point of that? And somebody who has that, whether it's from a computer or it's just how people are trained to follow an algorithm, this is what you do. Is this sort of the human equivalent of an AI system being trained to recognize images of dogs, but being presented with the image of a bird and not really knowing how to change out of the algorithm? Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of let's say the limitation of this example that I gave, is that I recognize that a lot of practice in medical settings, like the one you just gave, are in some ways algorithmic already, even if it's not through a computer, right? So this is kind of a broader critical intervention on health and medical contexts, where again needs to be get out of this algorithmic approach, whether that's through a computer or a template or just the training that professionals go through. And this is, I'm certainly far from the first person to talk about this, but it is something that seems increasingly important now that this algorithmic approach is even further out of the hands of a human than, say, just kind of that template that's back at the nurse's station or whatever, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about how we try to emulate those kind of interactions in a computer system. We're presented with an iPad and you go through and you check some boxes, and it's essentially doing what a nurse or a medical professional might have done, and they're following a routine, an algorithm, a recipe. And if the recipe if you deviate from the recipe, they isn't sure what to do with that information. Which brings me to my last question, which is, can any machine or algorithm or pile of computer code, which, as you claim, may be psychopathic, ever pass a Turing test if empathic attunement is a criteria?
Well, assuming that I understand the question and the Turing test correctly, then I would say that that one that is able to exhibit, if that's the right word, have empathic attunement, would be would pass the Turing test, with better
flying colors,
flying colors, with the highest grade. precisely that precise. If the question is precisely, is this a human or a machine? I think that it's precisely the empathic attunement aspect that makes us human, and not the thinking aspect.
Yeah, and that's what really struck me is as we're developing algorithms and we want them almost in some instances to behave as if they're human, this empathic attunement, adjusting to the point of view of another, having a theory of mind, if you will, for what the other maybe what their motivations and their expectations are. Without that, a computer is just going to be another psychopath that we have to contend with
Yeah,
in a world full of them.
that's
Anyway,
that's right.
Jarrett, thank you so very much. This was very thought-provoking. It has a lot of relevance to the topic of how we're thinking about AI applications, what that really means as they, as we embed this into health-related research, health-related practice in medicine, and in our understanding of how we're going to try and create smart health systems and AI-driven methodologies. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. This was super fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. It was really my pleasure.
Everybody have a wonderful